Europe is rearming. It's part of a massive global defence spending boom that could reshape the continent's politics and its economy.
How on earth can this new spending on top of that be made? And I don't think anyone's really squared the circle on that.
So let's take a look at Europe's defence boom. This is Reuters Econ World. I'm your host, Carmel Crimmins, in Dublin. To look at the economic and the political ramifications of Europe's promise to spend more on arms and armies, I rang up Mark John. He's Reuters' European economics editor, but also someone with deep experience reporting on the region's military. Mark John, welcome to Reuters Econ World.
Thanks, Carmel. Good to be here.
Listen, you're the perfect person for this pod because I know you're the economics editor for Europe now, but in a previous life, you were the defence caro covering NATO in Brussels, right?
Yeah, very different times, actually. So that was back in 2004. I was the NATO correspondent in Brussels at the time. So it was a couple of years after 9/11. It was a world of coalitions of the willing, and NATO was basically in search of a mission for itself, then actually trying to find relevance in this new world. And it was also a time actually of relatively low tensions between NATO and Russia, believe it or not. There was such a thing as the NATO-Russia Council, where they'd talk about possible areas of cooperation. We as journalists would get invited over to the residence of the Russian ambassador to NATO to talk about stuff. Yeah, all very different. Started changing from about 2008 when Russia invaded Georgia, I guess.
Yeah.
And then clearly by 2014 and annexation of Ukraine, things had changed quite a bit.
I mean, you mentioned it's totally different times. It really is, right? We've got the war in Ukraine, we've got wars in the Middle East, we have got a US president who is redefining geopolitics, and it seems like all the rich countries are rearming. From your perch as an economics editor, it's a real moment, isn't it, for the global economy?
Oh yeah, clearly, yeah. So I mean, we see the figures like everyone else. I was looking at the report that SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, I think is the full name.
Yeah.
For 2024, there was $2.7 trillion worth of spending on defense globally. And that's the highest ever recorded.
I mean, that figure, $2.7 trillion. So that's the current spending.
Yeah.
But, you know, there's more to come, right? I mean, NATO recently have agreed to sort of radically up their spending, right? The NATO members.
That's right, yeah. So one of the things that came out of the Hague summit of NATO a few weeks or so ago was a commitment to increase defence spending to 5%.
Mm-hmm.
Now, bear in mind that up until quite recently, most NATO countries were not even hitting the 2% target for defence spending. This is 2% of their GDP, by the way.
Right.
So 5%, that breaks down as 3.5% of what is known as core spending, which is the sort of things that you and I would recognise as military spending, so on weapons and things like that.
Tanks and bullets and, yeah.
Exactly. And then 1.5% on what's known as non-core, which are the sort of things which support a defence effort in various ways. And that's where there's going to be a big debate about how generous and how loose you can use that definition, non-core.
Why do they come up with this distinction between the 3.5 and the 1.5? It sounds like a fudge.
Well, I suppose one of the consequences of this is that it's going to potentially make it easier for countries to hit the 5% if, for example, they can argue that 1.5% category are things that also have a civilian function as well.
Right.
It might include things that they were planning to do already, like upgrade roads, for example. So on one level, it certainly makes these targets more realistic. I think there's kind of also a justification in the sense that defence efforts clearly don't happen in a vacuum. But for example, going back to the road example, if you are going to be all of a sudden spending more money on tanks, and that part of the rationale for that is that you might in the future need to get them very quickly to the front with Russia, then you'll need really well managed upgraded roads to do that. So there is a kind of a logic there to getting it. I think at the moment the debate is, as I say, how sincerely and how honestly are those categories going to be applied to the new spending? and how much of it will actually genuinely be new spending and how much of it will be genuinely related to the defence effort.
Yeah. I mean, the case seems to be being made by Europe that this defence spending will drive economic growth. Like the European Commission says, it will bring benefits for all countries. But is that really the case, Mark? What does economic history tell us? I mean, because historically, military spending isn't seen as a major growth booster, right?
I mean, my take on this is that no one is claiming that the reason that we're doing this is because of the economy. Is not the primary justification for doing this, right?
Right.
It's very clear that for Europe's politicians at the moment, they have accepted that for strategic and security reasons, and fundamentally because they no longer feel that they can trust the US commitment to security in Europe with a threatening Russia on its doorstep, that they now finally need to do this. That is the big reason for doing it. And yes, you will then get, I think, politicians throwing in the idea that this is potentially good for jobs, that it will bring money into the economy and so on. But that is, if you like, a secondary argument in this. The reason I think that no one puts that up too highly as an argument is because it's widely known that defence spending isn't as efficient in terms of producing growth in the wider economy as other forms of spending.
Why is that? Why is it not efficient?
So economists talk about something called multipliers, which is what are the knock-on effects of spending in one area on the economy as a whole. So broadly speaking, if you spend $1 or 1 yuan or 1 euro on the economy, and that gets you €1 or $1 yuan of output, then you have a multiplier of 1.
Right.
There are some things which are very good to creating multipliers. Now, typically, economists have spoken about, say, for example, going back to the road again. If you build a road and you are hiring lots of local people who then get wages and then spend that money locally, that creates a multiplier effect.
Yeah.
If you're getting lots of materials from local suppliers who then get money for that, are able to pay their people more, that creates even more multipliers. So in the case of road building, you get multipliers sometimes up to 2.5.
Oh, okay.
So in terms of the wider economy, you could argue that's a very good deal. In terms of defence spending, for a number of reasons, it's much, much lower than that. In fact, often or not, the multiplier will be below 1.
Okay.
In the sense that you will not be getting all of your money back in terms of the impact on the economy.
Right.
So why is that? So I think some of these things we know intuitively, right? I mean, if you are building munitions and those munitions immediately get sent to a warehouse and get locked up until they are used, if they're used at all, then clearly that doesn't have a knock-on effect. As we know, a lot of countries don't make all of their own weaponry, so that's going to have to come from foreign suppliers.
Right.
So, in that sense, the local economy isn't really going to get a lot of that. Other reasons, defence spending tends to be quite opaque. There's a kind of a lack of scrutiny on the area because it's sensitive. When you get a lack of scrutiny, you also get inefficiencies in spending. There's the potential for more waste in terms of spending.
Right.
So there are some economists who actually say that if you then add on top of that the fact that what you're spending defence, you're having to take from elsewhere in the economy, perhaps from areas that actually produce better multipliers, the overall effect could even be negative.
Right.
In fact, it could actually decrease the amount of output you get. That obviously we will have to see. That is, and back to your original question, Carmel, no one is saying that. There is a hope, I think, that all of this new spending will create overall at least some greater activity in, for example, the European economies, and that this will therefore give some kind of boost. How much that is, yet to see.
All right, a little quiz for you to see how much you know about defence spending. Which member of NATO spends the most on defence as a proportion of their GDP? Is it A, the US, B, Poland, or C, Turkey? Stay tuned, we'll have the answer at the end of the show. Up next, we talk about how the changing nature of warfare impacts economies. The use of drones in the Ukraine war is creating major financial asymmetries on the battlefield. A $40 drone versus a $200 million tank, for example? Our sister pod, Reuters World News, did a whole episode on drone warfare last month. I'll put a link to it in the description to this show. You can also find it on the Reuters app. Check out the podcast tab. You'll find it under Reuters World News or on your favourite podcast platform. There's also, I suppose, the evolutions that we're seeing on the battlefield and how they kind of affect things, because certainly in Britain, the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, has talked about defence offering sort of the next generation of good, secure, well-paid jobs. But what we're seeing in Ukraine is that you don't need a big industrial base to arm for war. It's obviously excelled at producing drones and they now rule the battlefield. So I suppose if politicians are hoping for lots of jobs growth from this defence spending push, they might be being overly optimistic, right?
Yeah, so I guess there's a couple of ways of looking at that. So one, as you say, defence spending has always been capital intensive,
right,
in the sense that, it doesn't require as many people to do it as other forms of the service economy, for example, being something which is sort of classically labour intensive. Drones takes it into another level altogether, because if you can have people sort of sitting remotely doing warfare in the place of units of soldiers and so on, then clearly that could potentially reduce the amount of labour you need altogether.
Yep.
And therefore, yes, you won't get the benefit from that, you could argue. I suppose, on the other hand, if you've got very sort of tech-heavy military going in, which then has knock-on effects on certain civilian technologies,
right,
then you could argue that it's going to get the benefit that way. And there has been, I guess, a history of technologies that have emerged from the military sphere straight into civilian usage. The obvious one being the internet, for example, but also, radar, GPS, a number of technologies like that started off at least partially in the military zone.
It's the idea that if you invest in military R&D, that can drive innovation, which can drive productivity. Europe's really going to have to up its game there, though, isn't it? I saw a stat saying that EU expenditure on R&D is just 4.5% of defence spending at the moment, compared to 16% for the US. So if Europe is looking for sort of an economic dividend from all of this, they're going to have to rework how they spend right now. Less on troops, more on research labs.
I think this is really reopening the question about how efficient European defence spending altogether, actually. I mean, at the moment, the debate is very much around how much more they're going to spend. And as we've been saying, will that go up from around 2% up to 3.5 or 5% or whatever? But then there's the other question about, should they be doing this more efficiently? So at the moment, in the EU, you have 27 countries, each with their individual armies, individual control centres and so on. And there's an enormous amount of overlap in terms of their spending. So, for example, there are about 30 different armoured personnel carrier types in Europe, because each country wants to have its own APC.
Right.
Wouldn't it be a lot more efficient, people argue, if European countries agreed on one certain type of APC that could be built and procured in common, as it were? And that would create efficiencies. It would be a lot less expensive to do that. But there are these sort of national, if you like, jealousies, national resistance to doing that kind of thing.
Yeah. Oh, I was going to ask, why does every country want its own armoured personnel carrier? Is it really that it's sort of like a national pride?
There's an element of national pride, isn't there? But it also goes back to all those kind of home bias questions that we talked about before. I mean, obviously, they want to make sure that it's their people that are being employed in doing the manufacture of these things. There's also, I guess, security strategic reason for wanting that too. These areas are very sensitive, so you might feel that you don't necessarily want another country manufacturing your APCs for you,
right,
or your other areas of defence kit.
But then, of course, it's kind of ironic because imports right now account for more than 80% of Europe's procurement, and the vast majority of it comes from the United States. So really, if Europe is going to spend more on armaments, it's the US economy right now that's going to benefit, really.
Yeah, definitely.
If kind of current buying trends continue.
Yeah. So, I mean, you're not the first person to have sort of made that observation exactly. So again, that's not something which is really going to get much increased GDP, increased multiplier going for these home economies in Europe. Absolutely.
If Europe wants to boost economic growth, then it really needs to kind of rethink its attitude towards production, right? So maybe going to have to get better at leaving aside, I suppose, national jealousies or however you want to describe it, and actually, pool resources, restructure how they buy weapons, rather than it just being having multiple suppliers, actually centralizing it, right? They're going to have to sort of break down barriers.
Yeah, exactly. So I think joint procurement is going to be one big thing that could actually facilitate that. I find it striking how little that has been mentioned in the debate so far, actually, this year. So I do wonder whether that will come up. It used to be, say, going back to the time when I was a defence correspondent,
Yeah.
Europe had such a thing as a European Defence Agency, whose very task was to create these kind of synergies to allow joint and more efficient procurement.
Yeah.
And I guess the other angle is, of course, to try and work out what are the areas of defence research in terms of the technologies and so on that are most apt to kind of, yield the beneficial knock-on effects for the rest of the economy as well.
And then, of course, on the other side of the equation, it's how you fund this, like, because the long-term economic effects of all of this will kind of depend on how countries work out how they're going to actually fund this, where they're going to get the money from, right? So funding through tax increases would be politically unpopular and actually bad for growth. And if you fund it through spending cuts, that's going to lead to trade-offs, right? Maybe you're going to have to spend less on social welfare. But funding through borrowing, which I think economists would argue is actually the best for the economy in terms of growth, that's really difficult for certain countries. Like for the UK and France, they're already leveraged up to the hilt.
Yeah.
So how is like Britain, France, how are they going to actually do this? How are they going to meet this target?
You've hit the nail on the head. I mean, the IMF actually said quite clearly that basically if we're going to get more, permanent increases in defence spending, it should be matched with permanent revenue increasing measures.
In other words, increasing taxes.
Indeed.
Okay.
Or you have to cut spending.
Yeah.
And that's very tricky. At the moment, so people are assuming that this is going to come with higher borrowing.
Right.
If you like, one of the big differences between now and previous defence spending surges, typically, let's say, go back to wartime, to World War II, for example, is that a lot of these countries already have really elevated debt levels. Around the world now, we're getting to a situation where global public debt is about 100% of global GDP. At the time of World War II, it was about 50 to 60% or so.
Wow.
So,
Yeah.
budgets are already incredibly stretched.
We're already up to our eyeballs in debt, in other words.
Exactly.
Right.
So, I think at the moment, this is going to be funded by national budgets, and there are some that can do that. Germany notably does have the leeway to spend more on defence and has made clear that that's what it wants to do. We are still waiting to see how countries like France and Italy can do that. France is barely able to get its budget together as things stand at the moment. And I think it was only last week that President Macron said that on top of all of those stresses, yes, there would have to be more defence spending. So we await the outcome of the current budget talks, which are incredibly difficult in Paris anyway. Italy, for example, also a very high debt country, is insisting that a lot of this needs to come from joint EU borrowing.
Right.
This is something that Germany and the Netherlands, notably, are absolutely dead set against. So for now, at least, that seems to be ruled out. But it does make you wonder how on earth Rome can afford this when, on top of everything else, it's got debt levels way above 100% already.
Well, it kind of makes you think, is this actually going to happen at all? Are we actually ever going to see these levels of, 3.5% of GDP on core defence, 1.5% on sort of related? Is it actually going to happen? Because it's meant to happen over 10 years, right?
Yeah.
Which gives countries a long time to get there. And so in Europe's case, the destination may never be reached.
Well, that's right. You remember the pictures from the NATO summit in The Hague a few weeks or so ago, and Donald Trump was able to walk away from that summit congratulating himself on how he'd managed to persuade the Europeans to finally spend more money on defense and so on.
Yeah.
But as you say, this is 10 years. Who knows what's going to happen in 5-10 years? For one thing, there's also no particular monitoring mechanism in place to work out exactly who is doing what sort of progress is being made on that front. And then there is the big question as to what exactly is going to count as defence spending and what is not. Even before people were walking away from the Hague summit, there's a question about, well, can we incorporate elements of spending that we already plan on road building, other elements in that defence spending, given that it will make the overall defence effort more efficient. So, yeah, a lot of reason to be sceptical at this stage, I would say.
This is the third instalment in our run of longer podcasts. Thank you so much for all the nice comments so far. Some of you have suggested there might be a happy medium between the longer format of 45 minutes and our shorter shows. Is that this week's episode? Let us know. You can tell us what you think, either in the comments section of your favourite podcast platform or ping me on LinkedIn. Even if countries, you mentioned Germany, they have the ability to go to market, to borrow more to fund this. If other countries manage to do the same, it does mean more borrowing means higher interest rates down the road, right?
There absolutely is, yeah. So, if as a result of this, we see European capitals issuing more bonds, then investors will demand higher premiums to buy those bonds.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, not only is the level of debt going to go up, but it's also going to be more costly. So, the level of debt servicing will increase for sure. And that increases, yet again, the stresses on budgets. And I think there is a concern that is going to lead to lower spending elsewhere and a lower prioritization of other things, be it climate change action or welfare states, education, and so on.
And also potentially cuts to social welfare, right? Because one thing that sort of distinguished Europe from the rest of the world is we've had this peace dividend for the past number of years, which has enabled countries to spend more on taking care of their citizens, social welfare, right? Pension costs and things like that. So there are concerns, aren't there, that if in order to pay for this defence increase, those items get cut, that it will fuel discontent in European countries.
I think it's a very big concern, yeah. This really is the big question, because even before this year, even before this new push for defence spending, Europe was not really able to afford the amount of spending on pensions for populations that were already aging, on welfare states that were growing to match their needs. So how on earth can this new spending on top of that be made? And I don't think anyone's really squared the circle on that at the moment.
And then there's the political ramifications. We've already seen far-right parties doing well in Europe, feeding off popular discontent with cost of living. So there is that political aspect to it, right?
So I think politically for European governments, it's a huge challenge to be able to make the case for the type of sacrifices that will be required to do this. They will have to convincingly explain to their electorates that there is no choice but to finally increase the spending on defence needed to ward off threats from, among others, Russia or not. And that, as we've seen, is quite a difficult challenge. There are lots of European voters that do not see things like that. And yeah, if they don't do that, then inevitably there will be populist parties that will come in. In fact, actually, not just populist, there will be parties that are simply making the different argument, and they will win voters.
If you're a regular listener to this show, you'll know that I love to talk about debt and interest rates and inflation, all that good stuff. But did you know I also write about it? I publish an econ newsletter every week to accompany this show. I'll put a sign-up link in the description to this week's episode. You can also sign up on the Reuters app. Just go to newsletters and search for Reuters Econ World. Now, within Europe, the closer geographically you are to Russia, the more this kind of defence spending push is actually not controversial. It's kind of welcomed, right? So countries in Eastern Europe, like Poland, the Baltic countries, they've already upped their defence spending even before this pledge from NATO. What can we learn from their experience? How's it gone from them economically?
So as I understand it, and this is just sort of speaking to our correspondents around Europe, that by and large, as you suggest, it is easier to make the case for higher levels of defence spending in those countries nearest the threat. So, the Central European countries, the Baltic countries, and the Nordic countries. That said, it is not without, again, sacrifice. There was a study, I think, produced by Estonia's central bank in 2023, which did conclude that there were drawbacks for overall economic growth from this amount of defence spending.
Huh.
And interestingly, I think one of the things that it really hit on was the issue for labour markets. If you have a higher than average mobilisation of essentially young people going into your armies, then clearly that creates labour shortages elsewhere in the economy, and that drags on growth.
I mean, we're seeing that already in Russia, right? That's an economy which has been on a war footing now for a number of years, and labour shortages is definitely an issue, and inflation is definitely an issue.
Absolutely. Yeah. So in Russia, I mean, we're seeing this before our own eyes in the sense that sort of this huge mobilization is creating labor skills shortages in certain parts of the economy. Also, the fact that you're in some cases having to provide very generous remuneration to persuade people to go to the front means that money in return is creating bubbles of inflation in the local economy. And that's on top of obviously what the massive military spending is doing in terms of creating, more activity, more demand in the economy, which also filters through in terms of pressures on pricing, not least because international sanctions obviously limit the supply of certain goods in the economy.
Right now, when you look at like stock market performance, currency performance, the euro is up double digits against the dollar. The last time I looked, the Euro Stock 600 was outperforming the S&P 500. It seems like in this new world order that we have, that Europe seems to be doing well. It's attracting investment. Are people being overly optimistic about how well this is going to go for the European economy?
So some of it clearly is down to optimism that greater spending in Germany is a sort of a game changer for Europe as a whole.
Yeah.
Because people have been talking about the imbalance within the European economy because of Germany's austerity-minded policies for years now.
Mm-hmm.
So there is that element. Clearly, the other factor is the growing mistrust of the US itself, which is pushing people to look at other areas to invest in.
Mm.
And, as European politicians frequently say, one thing that Europe does have on its side is, I think, this reputation for rule of law, that, yes, it has these very boring processes and to go through, and there is a sense of kind of, legality that needs to be adhered to, which right now, for many investors, seems to be somewhat reassuring. As far as the optimism is concerned, well, I guess we'll have to see. Europe has a habit of going somewhat slowly because it needs to go by consensus. It needs to make sure that at least, a decent majority of the 27 EU capitals are behind anything it does.
Yeah.
There's not much you can do about it. That is part and parcel of the project, but it does tend to slow things down.
Mm.
There are people out there, Christine Lagarde, particularly the ECB president, I think has really identified this actually, that it can be a moment for Europe. In some ways, it should be the moment that Europe steps up, but it needs to do its homework in so many different areas.
Mm-hmm.
It needs to make its capital markets more appealing to investors. There are a number of inefficiencies that need to be ironed out. And it could also be the moment that you create more, they're called safe EU assets.
Yeah.
So, more joint borrowing at the European level that investors have actually said they want. So you are going to have to, try and find agreement in some of these really tricky areas. And at the moment, I have to say that even now, we're not necessarily seeing that happen as quickly as some would like.
Mark, is there a deep irony, when you think back to when you were working in Brussels for NATO? Back then, it was a sort of an organization, as you say, almost in search of a mission. But financially speaking, economically speaking, its main constituents, its main members were probably in a much better economic place. In other words, if this had been asked of them then, when you think about their finances, they would have been far better positioned, right, to execute on something like this.
Yeah, no, I think there's a rather cruel irony, isn't it? This was obviously before the global financial crisis,
Yeah.
which in many ways, Europe is still just about recovering from. In some cases, the scars are still very much there, very vivid. So yes, I think even for people who ardently believe in European integration, there is a degree of, well, it probably verges from frustration to disappointment that some of these questions weren't addressed when they were first identified. And as you say, when there were more resources to try and do something.
A big thank you to Mark for his time and analysis. You can catch his work and all our great economic coverage on Reuters.com and the Reuters app. Now, what about that quiz? Which NATO member is the biggest spender on defence? The options were the US, Poland, and Turkey. And the answer is Poland. Let us know if you want more of these quizzes in our show. You can tell us in the comments section of your favourite podcast platform. This is Reuters Econ World. Every week, we go deep on the economic principles and ideas driving the biggest news around the world. If you want to tell us what you thought of this week's show, please drop us a line in the comments section of your preferred podcast platform. You can also reach out to me on LinkedIn. Sound design, music composition, and engineering on this episode was by Josh Summer. Our podcast team includes Kim Vanell, Tara Oakes, Gail Issa, Christopher Walljasper, Jonah Green, David Spencer, Bilka Labaran, and Sharon Reich-Garson. Our executive producer is Leela de Kretzer. Remember, for all your daily news, check out our weekday show, Reuters World News. You can catch it on the Reuters app or wherever you listen to your podcasts.